I came back to marry you, the Apache woman said, and the whiskey glass slipped from Elias Mercer's hand so fast it shattered across the saloon floor before anyone breathed a word. The piano stopped first, then the laughter. Then even the wind outside seemed to hold itself still against the dusty windows of Black Hollow. Elias stood near the counter with his burned right hand frozen midair, staring at the woman framed by the morning sunlight pouring through the swinging doors. She wore dark buckskin stitched with faded turquoise beads, her long black hair moving softly in the desert wind like smoke over firewood, and behind her, almost hidden beneath the golden haze rolling through town, sat nearly 80 Apache riders on horseback. Silent, watching, waiting. Nobody in Black Hollow had ever seen warriors ride into town without rifles raised or voices shouting. But these men said nothing. They only watched the woman standing in front of Elias Mercer like the whole frontier had led her back to this exact moment. Elias swallowed hard. His throat felt dry as canyon dust. You got the wrong man, he said quietly, though even he could hear the weakness in his own voice. The woman stepped closer, calm, certain. Her dark almond-shaped eyes never left his face. 14 years ago, she said, a cowboy pulled a little Apache girl from a burning wagon near Red Mesa Creek. Elias felt something old shift deep inside his chest. A memory buried beneath years of silence and whiskey and hard winters. He remembered smoke, rain mixed with ash, tiny hands clutching his shirt while flames cracked through the desert night. But the memory had always felt distant, like a dream that belonged to another man. The saloon keeper leaned forward behind the counter. Somebody near the poker table muttered under his breath. Nobody understood why a woman like her would travel across half the frontier for a forgotten rancher who barely spoke 10 words a day anymore. Elias looked older than 39. The desert did that to a man. Sunburned skin, dust caught in every wrinkle around the eyes, a jawline roughened by years without comfort. Most folks in Black Hollow avoided him altogether. They whispered about the fire that destroyed his old ranch 12 years earlier. Said every person close to Elias Mercer eventually disappeared into bad luck and smoke. But the Apache woman did not look afraid of him. If anything, she looked at him the way travelers looked at water after crossing 50 miles of desert. Then she slowly reached into the leather pouch hanging from her belt and pulled out a thin silver bracelet blackened by age and fire. Elias stopped breathing. He knew that bracelet. 14 years ago, he had ripped it from his own saddlebag to wrap around the bleeding wrist of a little girl trapped beneath burning wood beside Red Mesa Creek. He remembered her crying softly while the storm rolled overhead. Remembered carrying her nearly half a mile through mud and smoke before Apache riders appeared through the darkness. Elias had left before sunrise. Never stayed long enough to learn whether she survived. The woman held the bracelet carefully in both hands now like it carried the weight of 2 lifetimes. My name is Nayeli Takota, she whispered. And I never forgot the man who stayed when everyone else rode away. Outside, one of the Apache horses suddenly stamped against the dirt road. The sound echoed through the dead silence of town. Elias glanced past her shoulder toward the riders waiting beneath the pale Arizona sun. And for the first time in 14 years, he realized they were not there to threaten Black Hollow. They were there because of him. The silence inside Black Hollow Saloon stretched so long that even the ceiling fan seemed afraid to creak. Elias Mercer slowly bent down and picked up the broken pieces of glass from the floor with his scarred hand, while every eye in town remained fixed on him and the Apache woman standing 10 feet away. Nobody understood what they were seeing, because men like Elias Mercer did not have people return for them, especially not after 14 years. Especially not women who arrived with 80 mounted warriors behind them. Elias dropped the broken glass onto the counter and wiped his hand against his faded coat. The smell of whiskey and dust hung heavy in the room. Outside, horses shifted softly beneath the heat of the Arizona sun. Nayeli remained still near the saloon doors, her eyes calm, patient, almost sad, like she had rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times during lonely nights beside distant campfires. Sheriff Wallace finally cleared his throat near the poker tables. Elias, he muttered carefully, you planning on telling us why Apache riders are sitting outside my town? Elias did not answer right away. He stared at the silver bracelet resting in Nayeli's hand instead. The leather beneath his collar suddenly felt too tight against his neck. 14 years earlier, he had tied that bracelet around a terrified little girl during the worst storm he had ever seen. Back then, Elias Mercer still believed a man could outrun his past if he rode far enough west. He had been younger, faster, foolish enough to think silence fixed things. But silence only buried them deeper. "I helped somebody once," Elias finally said quietly. "That is all." Some men in the saloon exchanged nervous looks. Others kept staring toward the windows where Apache riders sat motionless beneath drifting dust. Black Hollow was the kind of town where fear spread faster than fire in dry grass. One wrong rumor could empty the streets before sunset. Nayeli stepped farther inside, the soft leather of her boots brushing across old wooden boards. "You carried me nearly half a mile through smoke and rain," she said. "Your hands were burned so badly you could barely hold the reins afterward." Elias looked away from her, toward the far corner of the saloon where sunlight touched old whiskey bottles lined against the wall. He remembered those burns. Remembered waking 3 days later beside a creek with both hands wrapped in torn cloth. He had never told anybody what happened near Red Mesa Creek because nobody in those years wanted stories about saving Apache children. Frontier towns liked simpler stories. Heroes wore badges. Villains wore braids. Men survived by staying quiet. Elias became very good at that. Sheriff Wallace shifted uneasily. "You never mentioned any of this." Elias gave a tired smile that barely reached his eyes. Nobody asked. The room fell silent again. Then one older rancher near the window slowly removed his hat. "You mean to tell me," he whispered, "those riders outside came all this way because you saved her when she was a child?" Nayeli answered before Elias could. "No," she said softly. "They came because for 14 years, he believed nobody remembered what he did." Outside, the wind carried dust across the empty road while the Apache riders remained perfectly still beneath the blazing noon sun. And somewhere far beyond the distant canyon walls, thunder rolled low across the desert even though the sky above Black Hollow remained completely clear. That night, Black Hollow did not sleep. Lamps burned late behind dusty windows while whispers drifted through town like dry leaves across empty streets. Some people believed the Apache riders had come for revenge. Others believed Elias Mercer had hidden some secret for 14 years. But Elias sat alone on the porch outside his small ranch house nearly 2 miles from town, staring into the weak orange glow of a lantern while desert wind brushed softly through the sagebrush around him. The old ranch looked tired beneath the moonlight. Half the fence leaned crooked. The barn roof sagged near the north side. One lonely horse shifted inside the corral, its saddle still hanging where Elias had left it that morning. Nothing about the place looked worth returning to. Yet Nayeli had crossed half the frontier to find it. Elias rubbed his burned hand slowly against his knee while memories kept clawing their way back into his mind piece by piece. Smoke, rain, firelight moving across canyon walls. 14 years earlier, Red Mesa Creek had flooded after 3 straight days of desert storms. Elias had been driving cattle south toward Tucson when lightning struck somewhere near the canyon ridge. He remembered seeing smoke first, then hearing horses screaming through the rain. By the time he reached the overturned wagon near the creek, the storm had turned the entire canyon into mud and ash. Elias closed his eyes. Even now he could still smell wet leather and burned wood mixing together beneath the storm. He remembered finding the little girl trapped beneath broken wagon boards beside the swollen creek bed. Tiny hands, dark frightened eyes, rainwater dripping from black hair stuck against her face. She could not have been older than 9 years old. At first Elias thought she was already gone. Then she grabbed his sleeve with trembling fingers. "Please," she whispered in broken English. That single word had followed him for 14 years. Elias had never been a hero. Back then he was just another drifting cowboy trying to stay ahead of old mistakes and bad memories. But something about the fear in that little girl's eyes stopped him cold. He remembered tearing apart the wagon boards with blistered hands while rain poured harder around them. He remembered carrying her through thick mud while thunder cracked above the canyon walls. The child barely weighed anything, yet by the time he reached shelter near the creek bank, his arms shook from exhaustion. He had wrapped the silver bracelet around her bleeding wrist because it was the only clean thing he carried. Then came the sound of riders, dozens of them, emerging through the storm like shadows moving across water. Elias remembered Apache warriors circling the creek with torches glowing through heavy rain. He remembered placing the girl gently beneath a cottonwood tree before stepping back toward his horse. He had not waited for thanks. Men in those days did not survive long on the frontier by standing between frightened warriors and wounded children. Elias simply rode away before sunrise and buried the memory beneath years of silence. Until now, a soft crunch of boots against dirt pulled him from the past. Elias looked up slowly. Nayeli stood near the porch beneath silver moonlight, wrapped in a dark wool blanket against the cold desert air. For a moment neither spoke. The lantern flickered softly between them. Then Nayeli stepped closer and looked out toward the empty plains stretching beneath the stars. "You still remember the storm," she said quietly. Elias stared at the dust near his boots. "Some things never leave a man," he answered. Nayeli nodded once. Her expression softened in the lantern glow. "That storm never left me either," she whispered. Then she slowly placed something onto the porch railing beside him. A small piece of burned wood blackened by time. Elias felt his chest tighten the moment he saw it, because carved into the charred surface were the faded initials EM, the same initials he had carved into the wagon before riding away 14 years ago. Elias stared at the burned piece of wood resting on the porch railing while the desert wind moved quietly through the dry grass around the ranch. His initials were still there beneath the blackened surface, faded, crooked, carved by a younger man who had believed names meant nothing out on the frontier. For a long moment, he could not speak. Nayeli remained beside him beneath the pale moonlight, her hands folded calmly in front of her as though she had carried this memory for so long it no longer felt heavy to her. But Elias could see the truth in her eyes. She had carried it every single day. "You kept this all these years?" he finally asked, his voice rough like old leather left too long in the sun. Nayeli nodded once. "My father found it beside the creek after you disappeared." Elias leaned back slowly in the old wooden chair beside the lantern. The flame flickered against the deep lines across his weathered face. "I did not disappear," he muttered. "I just kept writing." A faint smile touched Nayeli's lips, though sadness still lived behind it. "Sometimes those are the same thing." Somewhere out near the canyon, a coyote cried beneath the stars. The sound drifted low across the empty plains before fading into silence again. Elias looked toward the dark horizon. He had spent most of his life listening to sounds like that. Wind, horses shifting in the dark, distant thunder rolling across desert skies. Quiet things. Safer than people. Safer than memories. "Why now?" he asked after a while. 14 years is a long time to wait before finding a man. Nayeli turned toward the corral where Elias's old horse stood sleeping beneath the moonlight. "Because I did not know your name until 3 winters ago," she said softly. "The man who drove cattle near Red Mesa Creek that year finally spoke about the cowboy with burned hands who carried an Apache child through the storm." Elias frowned. Slightly. "Ben Carter." Nayeli looked surprised. "You remember him?" Elias let out a tired breath. "Ben talked too much. Hard to forget a man like that." The faintest laugh escaped Nayeli then. Warm. Brief. It disappeared almost as quickly as it came. But hearing it did something strange to Elias Mercer. Something uncomfortable. Because the sound felt alive in a place he had spent years trying to keep empty. Nayeli slowly sat beside him on the porch steps. The blanket around her shoulders shifted softly in the wind. "After I learned your name," she whispered, "I searched every trading post between Arizona and New Mexico." Elias stared at her in disbelief. "For me?" She nodded. "Most people only remembered the fire at your ranch 12 years ago. They said you stopped speaking much after that." Elias's jaw tightened. The old pain moved behind his eyes before he buried it again beneath silence. The ranch fire was another memory he never touched if he could avoid it. Some scars healed wrong when a man looked at them too long. Nayeli studied his face carefully in the lantern glow. "You still carry that night with you," she said quietly. Elias looked down at his burned hand resting against his knee. The scars twisted pale beneath the lantern light, like dried riverbeds through desert earth. "A man carries what survives him," he answered. Nayeli reached into the folds of her blanket, then pulled out something wrapped carefully in soft cloth. Elias frowned as she placed it gently into his hands. It was an old sheriff badge, tarnished, bent near the edges. Elias felt the blood drain slowly from his face the moment he recognized it. Because 14 years ago, before the storm and before Red Mesa Creek. That badge had belonged to Deputy Thomas Hale, the same lawman who vanished the exact same night Elias rescued the Apache girl from the burning wagon. Elias held the tarnished sheriff badge in his scarred hand, while the lantern flame trembled softly between him and Nayeli. For a moment, the desert seemed to disappear around him. No wind, no horses shifting in the corral, no distant coyotes crying beneath the Arizona sky. Only the weight of old memories pressing down on his chest like stones buried beneath dry earth. Deputy Thomas Hale. Elias had not spoken that name out loud in 14 years. Most people believed the lawman vanished somewhere near the border after chasing horse thieves south into Mexico. Others claimed he had simply ridden away from the frontier like so many men eventually did. But Elias knew better. He remembered the storm near Red Mesa Creek too clearly for that. He remembered the burning wagon, the frightened horses, the rain slamming against canyon walls hard enough to drown out almost every sound except one. A gunshot somewhere deep in the storm. Elias slowly looked up at Nayeli. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. Nayeli studied the badge resting in his palm before answering. "My father carried it for many years." Elias frowned. "Your father knew Deputy Hale?" Nayeli nodded once. "The wagon you found near the creek did not belong to traders." The lantern crackled softly. Elias felt something cold move down his spine despite the warm desert air. Nayeli lowered her voice. "It belonged to men transporting Apache families north after taking them from reservation land near Fort Stanton." Elias stared at her without speaking. He remembered hearing stories about transports like that years ago. Wagons moving quietly through the territory under armed guard. Families disappearing into places nobody talked about afterward. Most men on the frontier pretended not to notice such things. It was easier that way. Nayeli looked toward the dark horizon stretching beyond the ranch fences. "My mother died before that storm reached Red Mesa Creek," she said softly. "My father escaped with me during the confusion." Elias tightened his grip around the badge. "And Deputy Hale?" Nayeli's eyes shifted back to him. Calm. Honest. "He helped us." Elias blinked slowly. "A lawman." "Not all men wearing badges were cruel," Nayeli answered. "Deputy Hale tried to lead us out through the canyon before the storm trapped everyone near the creek." The wind suddenly picked up across the plains, carrying dust through the dry grass around the porch. Elias felt his heartbeat growing heavier now as old pieces finally began fitting together. "After 14 long years. The deputy never made it out," he murmured. Nayeli lowered her eyes. "No." Silence settled between them again. Elias remembered seeing a shadow near the overturned wagon that night. A man lying beside the creek beneath rain and mud. Back then, Elias had been too focused on saving the little girl to think about much else. But now the memory returned sharper than before. A silver badge half buried near the water, blood mixing with rain. Elias closed his eyes briefly. "I should have searched longer," he whispered. Nayeli shook her head immediately. "No." Her voice carried sudden firmness now. "You carried a child through fire and flood while everyone else fled the canyon. My father always said the Creator sends only certain men into storms like that." Elias looked away from her again. He had spent years blaming himself for things he could not change. The ranch fire, the people he failed, the silence afterward. But hearing Nayeli speak about that night felt different somehow. Like someone opening a window inside a room locked too long. Nayeli slowly stood from the porch steps, then pulled her blanket tighter against the cold desert wind. "My father kept the deputy's badge because he believed one day the truth would matter." Elias frowned. "What truth?" Nayeli hesitated for the first time since arriving in Black Hollow. Then she looked directly into his eyes beneath the lantern glow. "Deputy Hale was murdered by men who still control this territory today." The lantern flame flickered harder in the wind. And somewhere far off beyond the dark canyon, horses suddenly began whinnying in the night. The horses in the corral grew restless as the wind rolled colder across the plains, their nervous movements breaking the silence around Elias Mercer's ranch. Elias slowly rose from the porch chair, the sheriff badge still resting heavily in his scarred hand, while Nayeli stood beside the lantern watching the darkness beyond the fence line. Something about the night had changed. The desert often warned men before trouble arrived. Sometimes through wind, sometimes through silence. Tonight it was both. Elias stepped off the porch and walked toward the corral, boots pressing softly against dry dirt. The old horse inside lifted its head sharply toward the northern ridge. Ears stiff, breathing uneasy, Elias narrowed his eyes toward the darkness stretching beyond the ranch. Then he saw it. Tiny moving lights nearly half a mile away. Lanterns, at least 6 of them, drifting slowly through the night like ghosts crossing the desert floor. Nayeli joined him beside the fence. "They found us faster than I expected," she said quietly. Elias did not take his eyes off the distant lights. "Who are they?" Nayeli hesitated for only a moment. "Men working for Clayton Booker." Elias felt his jaw tighten immediately. Everybody in Arizona territory knew that name. Clayton Booker owned half the cattle routes between Tucson and New Mexico. Ranches, freight lines, mining claims. Even sheriffs answered carefully when Booker walked into town. The man carried wealth the same way other men carried rifles. Quietly, but always visible. Elias had crossed paths with Booker only twice in his life. That had been enough. "Booker was near Red Mesa Creek 14 years ago?" Elias asked. Nayeli nodded slowly. "My father believed Booker paid men to move Apache families away from reservation land after silver was discovered beneath the northern canyons." Elias looked toward the approaching lanterns again. The riders were closer now. He could hear faint hoofbeats beneath the wind. Slow, controlled, not drunk cowboys or wandering thieves. These men rode with purpose. Nayeli folded her blanket tighter around herself against the cold. "Deputy Hale tried to expose them," she continued softly. "That is why he died in the storm." Elias remained silent for several seconds. Somewhere deep inside, anger began stirring beneath years of exhaustion and dust-covered regret. He had spent 14 years believing Red Mesa Creek was only another tragedy buried by the frontier. But now the memory looked different. Sharper, like seeing tracks clearly after rain washes dirt away. "Why come to me?" Elias finally asked. "Why not take this story to the governor or the army?" Nayeli looked at him with an expression almost painful in its honesty. "Because nobody would. Listen to an Apache woman carrying an old badge." Elias looked down at the tarnished metal still resting in his hand. She was right. Men like Booker survived because the frontier only listened to money and power. Not truth. Never truth. The approaching riders finally stopped near the edge of the ranch beneath a cluster of mesquite trees. 6 men sat mounted beneath the moonlight wearing dark dust coats and wide-brimmed hats. One rider slowly guided his horse forward. Elias recognized him immediately even after all these years. Tall frame, silver watch chain hanging beneath his coat, calm posture that never seemed rushed. Clayton Booker himself. The wealthy rancher removed his gloves carefully before speaking across the cold desert air. "Evening, Mercer." Elias rested one hand against the fence post. "Bit late for social calls." Booker gave a faint smile that never reached his pale eyes. "I heard Black Hollow received unexpected visitors today." His gaze shifted briefly toward Nayeli. Not cruel. Worse. Measured. Like a man studying property he thought already belonged to him. Nayeli remained perfectly still beside Elias. Booker looked back toward the old cowboy again. "I came to offer friendly advice," he said softly. "Some memories are safer left buried in the desert." The wind moved harder across the ranch then, carrying dust between the men beneath the pale moonlight. Elias stared at Booker without blinking. And for the first time in many years, he realized trouble had not followed him to Black Hollow by accident. It had finally caught up. Clayton Booker sat tall in the saddle beneath the moonlight, his silver watch chain catching faint flashes from the lantern hanging on Elias Mercer's porch. The other riders remained behind him near the mesquite trees, silent and motionless like men who had spent years learning how to make fear arrive before words did. Elias leaned one arm against the fence rail while desert wind rolled dust around his boots. Nayeli stood beside him without moving, though Elias noticed her hand slowly tightening around the edge of the wool blanket across her shoulders. Booker noticed it too. The wealthy rancher smiled faintly. "No need for tension," he said in a smooth voice that sounded more dangerous for how calm it remained. "I only came because Black Hollow has become unusually crowded." Elias narrowed his eyes. "Funny. My ranch has been empty for years until tonight." One of the riders behind Booker shifted in the saddle, but Booker raised one gloved hand slightly without looking back. The man became still again immediately. That told Elias everything he needed to know about the kind of authority Booker carried. Not loud, not emotional. The kind men followed because they feared disappointing it. Booker's pale eyes drifted toward Naeli again. You traveled a long way for a cowboy who has nothing left, he said softly. Naeli answered before Elias could speak. A man does not become worthless because the world forgets his name. Booker studied her for a second longer than necessary. Then he smiled again. Smaller this time. Your father used to speak exactly like that. The desert suddenly felt colder around the ranch. Elias glanced sideways toward Naeli. Her expression remained steady, but he saw the pain move briefly through her eyes before she buried it beneath calm silence. Booker noticed that too. Your father was stubborn, he continued. Cost him opportunities. Elias straightened slightly away from the fence post. Opportunities? Booker shrugged beneath his dark coat. The frontier changes, Mercer. Men either move with it or get buried beneath it. The wind carried the smell of approaching rain through the dry night air, even though the sky remained clear overhead. Somewhere beyond the ridge, thunder rolled low again across the desert. Booker slowly removed something from inside his coat pocket, then held it loosely between two fingers. A folded paper. Official. Thick. Elias frowned immediately. Booker extended it toward him. Deed transfer, Booker said calmly. Your ranch sits on land connected to the Northern Canyon water routes. Valuable land. Elias did not take the paper. This old place. Booker nodded. You would be surprised what becomes valuable when railroad maps begin changing. Naeli's gaze sharpened instantly beside him. Elias caught it from the corner of his eye. That reaction alone told him this visit had very little to do with simple land business. Booker folded the paper carefully again before sliding it back inside his coat. I am prepared to pay generously, he said. Enough for you to disappear peacefully somewhere warmer before winter. Elias let out a quiet breath through his nose. And if I say no? Booker looked toward the distant ranch house for a moment, toward the sagging barn, the tired fences, the lonely horse sleeping inside the corral. Then men far less patient than me may begin asking difficult questions about old storms near Red Mesa Creek. Silence settled hard between them. Elias felt anger building deeper now, slow and dangerous. Not the hot anger of younger men. Worse, the kind that waited quietly after years of regret. Naeli suddenly stepped forward one pace. Her dark eyes locked onto Booker beneath the moonlight. You are afraid, she said softly. Booker blinked once. Only once. But Elias saw it. A crack no wider than a knife edge beneath the rich man's calm expression. Naeli continued. You would not ride here in the middle of the night unless you feared what he might remember. The riders behind Booker shifted uneasily again. Even the horses seemed restless now beneath the growing wind. Booker's smile finally disappeared. Careful, he said quietly. Naeli did not move. My father warned me about men like you, she answered. Men who bury truth beneath money and call it peace. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Clayton Booker looked directly at Elias Mercer with something colder than confidence. Something closer to concern. Then his gaze dropped slowly toward the old sheriff badge still resting in Elias's hand. Clayton Booker's eyes remained fixed on the old sheriff badge resting in Elias Mercer's scarred hand while the wind moved harder through the ranch fences, carrying the smell of distant rain across the dark plains. For several long seconds nobody spoke. The riders behind Booker shifted uneasily beneath the moonlight, their horses snorting softly as dust curled around their boots. Elias could feel the tension tightening across the ranch like rope pulled too far. Then Booker slowly smiled again. Calm, controlled, but thinner now. Interesting thing about old badges, he said quietly. They make men believe dead stories still matter. Elias looked down at the tarnished metal in his palm. Deputy Hale's name remained barely visible beneath years of scratches and desert weather. 14 years buried beneath dust, storms, and silence. Yet somehow the badge still carried weight heavy enough to bring Clayton Booker riding through the night himself. That alone told Elias more than words ever could. You seem mighty worried about a dead story, Elias muttered. Booker adjusted the leather gloves in his hands before answering. I worry about misunderstandings. Naeli stepped closer beside Elias, her dark hair moving softly in the growing wind. Truth only sounds like misunderstanding to men who profit from lies, she said. One rider behind Booker cursed quietly under his breath, but Booker silenced him with a glance sharper than any knife. Elias noticed something then. The wealthy rancher was careful around Nayeli. Not frightened exactly. Respectful in the way men become respectful around things they cannot fully control. Booker finally turned his horse slightly sideways toward the dark ranch house. "You build a lonely life out here, Mercer," he said. "Would be unfortunate if trouble found it again." Elias felt the old anger stir deeper inside him now. Not because of the threat itself. Frontier men threatened each other every day. No, it was the word again that tightened his chest. Again. Booker knew about the ranch fire 12 years earlier. Knew too much. Elias slowly folded the sheriff badge into his coat pocket. "You got something to say about my ranch burning down?" he asked quietly. "Then say it plain." For the first time all night, Booker hesitated. Tiny. Brief. But enough. The wind groaned through the old barn roof behind Elias while somewhere inside the corral, the old horse stamped nervously against the dirt. Booker looked toward the distant horizon before speaking again. "Some places are meant to disappear," he said softly. "Especially places standing on valuable land." Elias narrowed his eyes. "Railroad routes." Booker gave a faint nod. "Water access too." Suddenly pieces began fitting together inside Elias's mind with slow, terrible clarity. His ranch fire. The pressure to sell neighboring properties. Families leaving Black Hollow one by one over the last decade. Men like Booker did not simply buy land. They waited for desperation to lower the price first. Nayeli seemed to reach the same conclusion at the same moment. "You burned people out," she whispered. Booker's face remained unreadable beneath the moonlight. "I build futures," he answered calmly. "The frontier does not survive on sentiment." Elias stared at him in silence. 14 years ago, he had believed Red Mesa Creek was tragedy born from chaos and storm. But now he understood something worse. Men like Booker created storms long before the rain arrived. The wealthy rancher slowly guided his horse backward a few steps. "You still have time to walk away from this," he said to Elias. "Take the money. Leave Arizona. Let old ghosts stay buried." Elias glanced sideways toward Nayeli. She stood motionless beside him beneath the lantern glow, her eyes fixed on Booker without fear. 14 years searching through deserts and trading towns for a man the world forgot. 14 years carrying memories everyone else wanted erased. Elias looked back toward Booker then. "You know," he said quietly, "for a rich man, you spend an awful lot of time afraid of poor people remembering things." Silence hit the ranch hard after those words. One of Booker's riders instinctively moved a hand toward his belt before Booker stopped him again, with only a look. The wealthy rancher studied Elias for several seconds longer beneath the cold desert moon. Then he slowly placed his gloves back on. "This conversation is not finished," he said softly. Elias rested one hand against the fence rail. "Feels finished to me." Booker gave a small nod, but his pale eyes drifted toward Nayeli one last time before turning his horse toward the dark plains. "Be careful who you trust with your future," he said quietly. "Sometimes gratitude becomes another kind of chain." Then the riders disappeared slowly into the desert night, while thunder rolled once more beyond the northern canyons. And beside Elias Mercer, Nayeli suddenly looked far less certain than before. The ranch stayed quiet long after Clayton Booker and his riders disappeared into the darkness beyond the northern ridge. Only the sound of wind moved through the broken fence posts and dry mesquite trees around Elias Mercer's land. The lantern hanging beside the porch flickered weakly now, its flame bending sideways each time the desert gusts swept across the plains. Elias remained standing near the fence for several minutes without speaking. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon where Booker vanished, though his thoughts were somewhere much farther away. Nayeli watched him carefully from beside the porch steps. "You know he will come back," she said softly. Elias nodded once. "Men like Booker never ride this far unless they already decided something belongs to them." Nayeli folded her blanket tighter around herself. "Then we should leave before sunrise." Elias finally looked at her. The words surprised him more than they should have. Leave. He had spent 14 years rooted to this dying ranch because he believed there was nowhere left worth going. Yet hearing Nayeli say the words stirred something restless inside him. A part of himself he thought disappeared long ago beside Red Mesa Creek. Elias walked slowly toward the porch and sat heavily in the old wooden chair again. The boards creaked beneath his weight. "You crossed half the frontier looking for me," he muttered. "Now you want to run?" Nayeli stepped closer into the lantern glow. Her copper-brown skin caught warm flickers of orange light, while the wind lifted loose strands of black hair across her face. "I did not come here to bury another man because of old ghosts," she answered quietly. Elias looked down at his scarred hands resting against his knees. "Ghosts do not scare me much anymore." Naeli's expression softened then. Sadness touched her eyes again, deeper this time. "That is what worries me." Silence settled gently between them. Somewhere out near the canyon, thunder rolled once more beneath the dark sky. Closer now. Elias leaned back in the chair and stared upward toward the stars hidden behind. Drifting storm clouds. "You know," he said after a while, "I spent years wondering if that little girl survived the storm." Naeli lowered herself carefully onto the porch steps beside him. "And?" Elias let out a quiet breath through his nose. "Some nights I convinced myself she did." He glanced toward her. "Other nights I figured the desert took everybody eventually." Naeli looked down at her hands folded in her lap. "The desert almost did." Elias frowned slightly. Naeli hesitated before continuing. "After my father died 3 winters ago, some men tried forcing our people farther north beyond the canyon water routes." Elias immediately understood. Booker again. Land. Railroads. Silver. Always the same hunger wearing different clothes. Naeli continued softly. "My father gave me the deputy's badge before he passed. He told me if truth ever had a chance to survive, I would find the cowboy with burned hands." Elias stared at the lantern flame dancing beside them. "Your father trusted me more than I deserved." Naeli slowly shook her head. "No, he trusted what you chose to do when nobody was watching." Those words settled deep inside Elias Mercer in a way he could not explain. Most men spent their lives being judged for their failures. Very few were remembered for their quiet mercies. The old cowboy suddenly noticed how cold the wind had become. Rain was coming. Real rain. Rare for Arizona this late in summer. He stood from the chair with a grunt and looked toward the barn. "Storm is moving fast," he muttered. "Your riders should find shelter before the wash floods." Naeli remained seated for another moment watching him. Then she smiled faintly. Small. Almost invisible beneath the lantern glow. "You still worry about everyone before yourself." Elias grabbed the lantern from its hook beside the porch. "Bad habit." He started toward the barn through the dark yard, boots crunching softly against dry dirt. Naeli followed a few steps behind him while thunder rolled louder above the plains. Then suddenly the old horse inside the corral let out a sharp, frightened cry. Elias froze instantly. The smell hit him first. Smoke. Thin at first, then stronger, rising from somewhere behind the barn. Elias Mercer stopped cold in the middle of the yard as the smell of smoke thickened against the wind. The old horse inside the corral kicked hard against the wooden rails again, panic rolling through the animal before the fire itself became visible. Then Elias saw it. A dull orange glow spreading behind the north side of the barn roof. Small for now, but growing fast. "No," he muttered under his breath, already moving. Naeli turned sharply beside him as thunder cracked somewhere over the plains. Elias. But he was already running through the dirt toward the barn with the lantern swinging wildly in his hand. The old structure groaned softly beneath the rising wind while smoke curled upward into the dark Arizona sky. Elias reached the barn doors and shoved one open hard enough for rusty hinges to scream in protest. Heat rolled out immediately. Not blazing yet. Worse. Fresh fire. Hungry fire. The kind that spread quietly before men realized how trapped they already were. Inside, the frightened horse pulled hard against its rope, eyes wide with terror beneath the smoke drifting across the rafters. Elias dropped the lantern outside the doorway and moved toward the animal without hesitation. "Easy," he muttered roughly. "Easy now." Behind him, Naeli rushed into the barn carrying a water bucket from beside the trough. "The back wall is burning," she warned. Elias looked over his shoulder and saw flames crawling upward through dry hay stacked near the rear corner. Too fast. Too deliberate. Nobody on the frontier accidentally stacked lantern oil beside hay bales during storm season. Booker. Elias felt the realization settle cold inside him. This was not warning anymore. This was pressure. He pulled the frightened horse loose while smoke thickened across the ceiling beams overhead. Outside, wind drove harder through the ranch yard as the storm finally reached Black Hollow. Rain began falling in scattered drops against the roof. Not enough yet. The horse bolted from the barn the moment Elias released it into the open yard. Nayeli moved quickly beside the flames, throwing water against the burning hay while sparks drifted upward into the darkness. Elias grabbed another bucket near the trough and joined her without speaking. For several desperate minutes, only the sound of rain, smoke, and rough breathing filled the night. Thunder rolled directly overhead now. The storm had finally arrived. Water mixed with dirt beneath their boots while smoke stung Elias's scarred hands and tired eyes. Then suddenly the old barn roof groaned again. Loud. Wrong. Nayeli looked upward instantly. Elias. He heard it too. One of the support beams had started cracking beneath the heat. Elias stepped backward immediately. Move. But Nayeli did not retreat. She pointed toward the far corner of the barn where a small shape trembled beneath hanging tools and feed sacks. Elias squinted through the smoke. A young colt, barely 6 months old, terrified and trapped behind fallen boards near the rear stall. Elias cursed softly under his breath. Leave it, Nayeli shouted over the growing storm. But Elias was already moving again. Rain hammered harder against the roof while flames crawled higher along the back wall. The colt struggled weakly beneath the debris, too frightened to escape alone. Elias reached the animal and dropped to one knee beside it, ignoring the sharp heat pressing through the smoke around him. His burned hands grabbed the heavy boards pinning the colt against the stall. Pain shot through his fingers instantly, old scars waking beneath fresh heat. Come on, he muttered through clenched teeth. Behind him, Nayeli suddenly appeared through the smoke and grabbed the other side of the fallen beam without hesitation. Together they lifted just enough for the trembling colt to break free and stumble toward the barn doors. But the moment the animal escaped, a loud crack split through the rafters overhead. Elias looked up just as part of the burning roof collapsed between them and the exit. Sparks exploded upward into the storm-dark air while smoke swallowed the center of the barn hole. For one terrible second, neither Elias nor Nayeli could see each other through the thick black haze. Then somewhere beyond the smoke, Elias heard Nayeli's voice call his name for the first time, not with calmness or patience, but fear. Smoke swallowed the center of the barn while rain hammered against the roof hard enough to turn the dirt outside into black mud. Elias Mercer coughed roughly as sparks drifted through the thick haze around him, the sharp smell of burned wood pressing deep into his lungs. Somewhere beyond the collapsed beam, Nayeli called his name again. Closer this time. Frightened, Elias pushed through the smoke toward her voice with one arm, shielding his eyes from the heat. The old barn groaned above them like a dying animal caught between storm and fire. Then he saw her. Nayeli stood near the far wall, half hidden behind drifting smoke, one hand gripping a support post, while burning debris blocked the narrow path between them. Her calm expression was gone now. Rainwater mixed with soot across her face as she searched for him through the haze. Elias, she shouted again. The roof is falling. He moved toward her immediately without thinking. Some part of him understood later would matter. Survival. Sense. But instinct reached her first. Always her. Elias grabbed a loose feed blanket from the ground and shoved it against the burning debris blocking the narrow opening between them. Smoke burned against his scarred hands while thunder cracked overhead hard enough to shake the barn walls. Nayeli rushed forward the moment the gap widened enough to pass through. For one brief second she caught hold of Elias's coat, sleeve through the smoke, and the look in her eyes stopped him colder than the storm outside. Not fear for herself. Fear for him. Real. Unhidden. The kind people only carried for someone they could not bear to lose. You should have left the colt, she whispered hoarsely. Elias looked at her through drifting smoke. You stayed too. Another loud crack exploded overhead. Both looked upward instantly as part of the roof shifted dangerously above the center stalls. Elias grabbed Nayeli's wrist and pulled her toward the barn doors. This time she did not resist. Rain slammed into them the moment they stumbled outside together beneath the storm-dark sky. The cold water hissed against the burning barn while sparks swirled upward into the night like dying fireflies. Elias bent forward, coughing hard. One hand braced against his knee while rain soaked through his coat within seconds. Nearby, the rescued colt pressed nervously against the corral fence beside the older horse. Nayeli stood beside Elias, breathing hard beneath the pouring rain, her dark hair soaked against her shoulders now. Behind them, the barn roof finally gave way completely with a heavy crash swallowed by thunder. Elias stared silently at the collapsing structure while rain streamed down his weathered face. 12 years ago, another fire had taken almost everything he owned. He remembered standing in ashes afterward, believing nothing else in life could still hurt. Yet watching the old barn collapse tonight felt strangely different. Because this time he was not standing alone. Nayeli slowly stepped closer beside him beneath the storm. "Booker wanted you afraid," she said quietly through the rain. Elias kept staring at the fire. Maybe he should have come 14 years earlier. Nayeli frowned slightly at him. Elias wiped rainwater from his eyes with one rough hand. "Back then I still knew how to run." Lightning flashed across the plains, briefly illuminating 80 Apache riders gathered silently near the edge of the ranch. Elias had not even heard them arrive through the storm. They sat motionless beneath the rain, watching the burning barn without speaking a word. Not threatening. Witnessing. Nayeli followed Elias's gaze toward them. "They came because they heard the smoke signal," she explained softly. Elias looked at the riders standing guard through thunder and rain around a ranch that barely belonged to him anymore. No man had stood beside him during the ranch fire 12 years earlier. No neighbors. No lawmen. Nobody. Yet tonight 80 riders crossed the desert through a storm because one Apache woman refused to let him face fire alone again. Elias felt something shift quietly inside his chest then. Something heavier than gratitude. More dangerous too. Nayeli suddenly reached toward his burned hand beneath the rain and carefully turned it over in her own. Her touch was warm despite the cold storm surrounding them. "You saved me once," she whispered. "You do not have to keep paying for that forever." Elias looked down at her hand resting against his scarred palm. Then slowly, for the first time since she arrived in Black Hollow, he closed his fingers gently around hers. Morning arrived slowly over Black Hollow after the storm, washing the desert in pale gold light and leaving the ranch soaked beneath drifting ribbons of fog. Smoke still curled weakly from the ruins of Elias Mercer's barn, while puddles reflected the early Arizona sun across the muddy yard. The Apache riders remained camped quietly along the ridge above the ranch, their horses grazing calmly beneath the cool morning wind. Nobody in town dared come near the property after the fire. Fear traveled fast across frontier towns. Faster than truth ever did. Elias stood alone near the burned remains of the barn, holding a blackened horseshoe he had pulled from the ashes moments earlier. The metal was still warm. Around him the ranch looked smaller somehow. Tired. Like a man finally too exhausted to hide his age anymore. Behind him, boots moved softly through wet dirt. Elias did not turn around. He already knew it was Nayeli. "You should rest your hands," she said quietly. Elias glanced down at the fresh burns running across his scarred fingers from the night before. "Hands heal." Nayeli stopped beside him beneath the pale morning light. "Not always." Elias looked toward the distant canyon instead of answering. Somewhere beyond those ridges sat railroad surveyors. Mining camps. Men like Clayton Booker already deciding which towns deserved to survive another decade and which ones would disappear beneath dust. The frontier was changing. Quietly. Ruthlessly. And men like Elias Mercer no longer fit inside the future being built. Nayeli studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "My riders leave by sunset." Elias nodded once. He had expected that. People like Nayeli still belonged somewhere. A tribe. A history. A future larger than one lonely ranch falling apart at the edge of Black Hollow. Men like Elias only belonged to silence. "Booker will come again after you leave," he said. Nayeli looked toward the burned barn remains. "Then come with us." Elias finally turned toward her then. The morning wind lifted loose strands of black hair across her face, while sunlight warmed the copper tones of her skin. She looked strong standing there beside the ashes. Strong in the way mountains looked strong. Quiet things that survived storms without asking permission. Elias lowered his eyes. "I do not belong with your people." Nayeli stepped closer across the muddy ground between them. "You belonged with my people the night you carried a frightened child through fire." Elias let out a tired breath. "That was a long time ago." Nayeli shook her head gently. "No, it only became a long time ago for you because nobody stayed long enough to remind you." Those words hit harder than Elias expected. He looked down at the burned horseshoe, turning slowly in his hand. Most of his life had become a collection of things left behind. Empty rooms. Silent fences. Graves he no longer visited because remembering hurt too much. Yet this woman crossed deserts and storms carrying proof that one decent thing he did still mattered after 14 years. Nayeli slowly reached into the leather pouch hanging beside her waist and removed the old silver bracelet again. The same bracelet Elias wrapped around her bleeding wrist beside Red Mesa Creek. She gently placed it into his scarred hand beside the burned horseshoe. "My father once told me something before he died," she whispered. Elias looked up at her quietly. Nayeli's dark eyes softened beneath the morning sun. "He said some people enter your life like rain." Her voice nearly disappeared into the wind then. "But a few arrive like water in the desert." Elias felt his chest tighten painfully around those words. Nayeli stepped even closer now until only inches remained between them. Not rushed, not uncertain, calm as sunrise over empty land. "I did not search 14 years to repay a debt," she said softly. "I searched because no man had ever made me feel safe before you." Elias looked at her for a long silent moment while the wind moved gently through the ruined ranch around them. Then, slowly, he removed the old leather cord from around his neck. A simple carved wooden cross darkened by years. Beneath sun and dust. The only thing he had carried continuously since before Red Mesa Creek. Elias placed it carefully into Nayeli's hand. "Then maybe," he said quietly, "you are the first person who ever came back for me too." 3 weeks later, the people of Black Hollow gathered silently along the dusty main street as 80 Apache riders moved through town beneath the golden light of early evening. Nobody laughed this time. Nobody whispered. The same townsfolk who once avoided Elias Mercer now stood quietly outside the saloon and general store, watching the old cowboy ride at the front beside Nayeli Dakota. The desert wind carried the smell of fresh rain across the valley while sunlight burned deep orange against the canyon cliffs beyond town. Elias sat straighter in the saddle than he had in years. Not younger, not healed, just lighter somehow. The scars on his hands remained. The grief remained too. But loneliness no longer rode beside him. Near the edge of town, Sheriff Wallace stepped forward from the boardwalk, holding an old folded paper in his hands. Elias slowed his horse. The sheriff cleared his throat awkwardly before speaking. "Word came from Tucson yesterday," he muttered. "Railroad survey got canceled through the northern canyon routes." Elias frowned slightly. Sheriff Wallace handed him the paper carefully. "Seems some documents reached the governor's office about land fraud and missing transport records from years back." Nayeli looked quietly toward the sheriff while Elias unfolded the paper. He immediately recognized Deputy Hale's name written across the official report. The old badge. The testimony preserved by Nayeli's father. 14 years buried beneath silence and dust had finally reached somebody willing to listen. Sheriff Wallace shifted uncomfortably beneath Elias's stare. "Clayton Booker packed his things 2 nights ago," he admitted softly. "Left Arizona territory before sunrise." The wind moved gently through town then, stirring dust across the empty street, while nobody spoke for several long seconds. Finally, Elias folded the paper slowly and tucked it into his coat pocket beside the tarnished sheriff badge. Deputy Hale deserved better than being forgotten, he said quietly. Sheriff Wallace lowered his eyes beneath the weight of those words. Elias gave a small nod and guided his horse forward again beside Nayeli. As they passed the saloon, the old rancher who once questioned Elias removed his hat respectfully. Then another man did the same. Then another. One by one, hats lowered quietly along the street while the riders continued through town beneath the setting sun. No speeches, no applause, just silence filled with the kind of respect frontier people rarely knew how to say aloud. By the time they reached the edge of Black Hollow, the sky had turned copper red above the desert plains. Elias slowed his horse near the old wooden sign marking the town border and looked back one final time. For years he believed this place only remembered his failures. Burn barns, empty land, long silences. But now he understood something different. Sometimes a man spends so long carrying shame that he forgets kindness leaves marks too. Nayeli guided her horse beside his beneath the fading sunlight. "Do you regret staying all these years?" she asked softly. Elias looked toward the distant horizon where open desert stretched beyond the last traces of town. The evening wind brushed gently through his gray-streaked hair, while somewhere far off, coyotes called beneath the coming night. Then he glanced toward Nayeli beside him. toward the woman who crossed half the frontier carrying an old silver bracelet and 14 years of memory, just to remind one forgotten cowboy that mercy still mattered. Elias smiled faintly beneath the weathered lines of his face. "No," he answered quietly, "because if I had left sooner, you never would have found me." Naeli's eyes softened with something warmer than gratitude now, something steadier, like home after years of wandering. Without another word, the two riders turned their horses west toward the open desert, while 80 Apache warriors followed silently behind them through the falling dusk. And long after the sound of hoofbeats disappeared beyond the canyon ridge, people in Black Hollow still spoke about the old cowboy with burned hands who once carried a frightened Apache child through a storm. Not because he was the fastest man on the frontier, not because he carried a rifle or a badge, but because when fear told everyone else to ride away, Elias Mercer stayed. And out in the west, that was the kind of thing the desert never forgot.